Good morning. This is Jeffrey Gross.
And this is Valerie Stivers.
We are Fretful Porpentine, the podcast. So, what is Fretful Porpentine?
The Fretful Porpentine is a podcast that explores classical music references in literature, mostly classic literature, although we will be doing some contemporary literature as well. Today we are talking about a particular piece of music mentioned in Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter.
Yeah, and just to kind of give you some background, of the two of us, Valerie is basically the books person and I'm basically the music person. Valerie insulted me once by calling me an expert. I much prefer to think of myself as an amateur, which comes from the verb to love. I have a deep love of classical music, and I'm writing a book to demystify it and help people fall in love with it the way I do.
And I have taken a sort of interdisciplinary approach to literature. I cook from literature. I write a food column for the Paris Review where I make up recipes based on food scenes in classic books. And this is another unusual and experiential way into a book, which is to explore the music mentioned by the author in the book. I've explored the food before, now we're exploring the music. And I also have the advantage of not being a classical music expert, so we are working out Jeffrey's method of teaching in real time as well. So Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter, there, of course, is so much to Roth, it would be hard to summarize him, but Roth wrote 27 or 29 novels, and...
But not 28. It was an odd number. You're sure about that?
I'm not. Roth was very prolific. He wrote a lot of books, and he wrote several different series, basically, and one of them was the Zuckerman series, in which the character Nathan Zuckerman was a autobiographical Philip Roth stand-in, and he was exploring writing and what it meant to be a writer in this particular series, although perhaps he did in all of his work. So this is the first of the Zuckerman novels. It's called The Ghostwriter, and it's about a young Nathan Zuckerman going to visit his literary idol, E.I. Lonoff, in the Berkshires or somewhere New Englandy and remote.
Somewhere writerly, right? Like a lot of writers, New York writers have cottages up in the Berkshires and that kind of thing. In fact, didn't Roth have a place in Connecticut somewhere?
I think so.
Northwestern Connecticut.
I think this was Roth's, this is part of the tension that Roth felt being a writer, was that you're supposed to be writing about life, yet as a writer, your practice requires enormous amounts of solitude and not really living life if you want to be serious about your writing. He spent grueling days at the desk, and in this book, at least, Zuckerman is a young man, and Lonoff is the older artist who already knows these secrets and lives in this isolation, pursuing his craft.
So Zuckerman, not to sort of overlook the obvious, Zuckerman is Roth's alter ego, right?
Yes.
To what extent, how much distance do you think there is between...
Well, Roth was always very salty about that stuff because he resented people saying that any of these characters were his alter egos or that any of it was not fiction. Basically, it's all fiction, according to Roth. However, he likes to play with that distinction. He had another series later where a character was named Philip Roth. So the tension between what's true and what isn't true and how we're supposed to read this is part of the tension of the book. So the reference, and I found this very interesting. I read these books recently for the first time, and they're very disorienting. You don't necessarily know where he's coming at anything and what's coming next for quite a long time when you get in here. And one of the early disorienting moments was Zuckerman has agreed to spend the night, and there's been some drama already because there's a young woman staying at Lonoff's house who Zuckerman finds very beautiful. Lonoff is married. Zuckerman is wondering what this woman could be to Lonoff. Her name is Amy Billette. So Zuckerman is sleeping over in Lonoff's study, and he's looking around, and here's what he sees. I'm going to read a passage. Pinned to the bulletin board beside his desk, the cell's only real embellishments were a little wall calendar from the local bank and 2 annotated index cards. One card bore a fragmentary sentence ascribed to Schumann, on Chopin's Scherzo number 2 in B flat minor, Op 31. Pausing for a moment. Jeffrey, what is op in this statement?
Opus.
Opus. Okay, Opus 31. Going back to the Roth. It read, so overflowing with tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt that it may be compared not inappropriately to a poem by Byron. And here's Nathan Zuckerman speaking, I didn't know what to make of it there, or rather what Lonoff made of it, until I remembered that Amy Bellette could play Chopin with great charm. So here we have, this is a great example of how textured and complicated almost everything in Roth is. We have Zuckerman exploring the office of his hero Lonoff, and he sees a little index card with a quote pinned up atop Lonoff's desk. On the index card, it says that there's a sentence ascribed to Schumann, who is Schumann?
Yeah, so Robert Schumann was almost entirely contemporaneous with Chopin in terms of his lifespan. Schumann was born, as was Chopin, in 1810. So they would have grown up with, well, we can't really go down this path, but, Beethoven was at the height of his career, and musical romanticism, in a way, is kind of a spasmodic attempt to come to terms with and react to Beethoven. But anyway...
So Schumann and Chopin were both romantics.
They were both romantics, they were contemporaries, and yet Schumann was Chopin's mentor. Because Schumann, among other things, and he was a very sort of, I guess nowadays we would say, multidisciplinary or multimedia kind of guy. For him, literature and music were intertwined, and thus writing and music were intertwined, and he was a journalist. He was a rather well-known music journalist, and so he boosted Chopin's career. And one of the interesting things about that is the lack of gratitude that Chopin showed him. And I'm not sure if that's because he disliked, feeling indebted to the German composer.
This is so interesting just in its very first sentences here, because we have Roth setting up a competitive relationship between himself and Lonoff, between Zuckerman and Lonoff, and this little blip in the study where there's this index card is also two classical musicians who had a competitive, in some way, relationship.
Right.
And a father-son relationship, although obviously they were the same age, but Schumann was the more established musician and Chopin was the upstart.
Yeah, he was the upstart, and he started up twice because he was born, of course, and grew up in Poland, and then immigrated to Paris. So he had to sort of reboot, and Schumann was again his mentor in that.
And Schumann is French?
No, Schumann is German. Schumann
was he in Paris?
No, and I don't know. How did news of music and compositions travel in those days? I don't really know. There was printed music. So, but Schumann was a North German, and unlike Brahms and many other, German or Austrian composers, he didn't, migrate to Vienna, which was the great center of, music in the Austro-Hungarian what's-this. So he ran this journal, musical, journal, and
right.
Publicized Chopin.
Right. So to recap, we have Schumann commenting on a Chopin scherzo. And I think we should hear the scherzo.
I think we should. We should hear the scherzo.
And after we hear the scherzo, Jeffrey will tell you what a scherzo is.
I will talk a little bit about it. Yeah, it's a musical form.
Scherzo first, talk later.
It's very good. Very good. That's what she said.
So yes, what we just heard is what you would call the A section of the scherzo. What does that mean? Just to boil down what makes a scherzo tick, this is kind of musical form for dummies because it really is actually quite a simple form and anybody can understand it. Scherzo, and it's sort of older, courtlier version of the minuet, is in a thing that's called ternary form, meaning it has three parts, A, B, A. So A was the first thing, and then you go to a contrasting B section, and whenever you have contrast, you have tension, right? That's the plot. And that tension is built up and then released by returning to the A section. So that's the form of a scherzo. Now you get it. Now you understand what scherzos are. So if you go to the symphony and there's a scherzo or a minuet, bang, you get it. So next we'll listen to the B section, which, as I said, is contrasting. It's more lyrical. It's less fierce and violent and, tempestuous, and more sort of whimsical, and it alternates between kind of a hymn-like thing, but also some capricious and really rather blithe stuff.
That sort of figure that you just heard, that ornamental thing, I refer to that as meringue. There's a lot of meringue in Chopin. I mean, that's a purely idiosyncratic, personal notion that I have.
No, but I can see it. It's good.
It really is part of the Chopin experience. Not necessarily in everything that he wrote, but many things. And it's so delightful. So it goes a little bit like... that right there, that, et cetera, et cetera. That's the meringue. It's just air. It's pure fluff. Its purpose is not to have any purpose. It's as though Chopin were saying, yes, all of these concerns of the human heart and the turbulence and the angst, why don't we just step out of that entirely? Step out of time for a moment, because we're not in strict time during the meringue. Let's just step out of time and pick some flowers.
Before we played the piece of music, we should have repeated the quote here, which was that Schumann described this Chopin scherzo as so overflowing with tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt that it may be compared, not inappropriately, to a poem by Byron. So you're going to talk about a scherzo and what it is, but just while the piece of music is fresh in our minds, the emotions being conveyed by that were tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt, which are conflicting and also, in some senses, hard to see how you convey with music.
Yeah, well, so that's interesting. I mean, scherzo comes from the Italian for joke. And I doubt he was the first to do it, but Beethoven is the guy who took the minuet out of the symphony and put the scherzo in, because the minuet didn't convey enough drama for him. And so the practice of having, a scherzo in the symphony, in our consciousness of it, relates to or goes back to Beethoven. These obviously are standalone pieces, these Chopin scherzos. And he wrote 4 of them at various times of his life, not all at once.
I'm confused. Symphonies have different named pieces of music in them?
They have different genres of music in them. I mean, like a rondo is a movement of a symphony could be a rondo. It could be in sonata form or various forms.
Okay.
And the third movement of a symphony, if it has 4 movements traditionally, and this is getting a little bit nuts and bolts, but would be a minuet in Mozart's.
This is interesting. I mean, a lot of people listen to symphonies and have no idea that it's full of named parts.
Yeah, well,
if they listen to symphonies at all. So
right.
Now we're learning something. So Beethoven removed the minuets because they weren't dramatic enough and wanted scherzos instead.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's one way to put it. Yeah, so
scherzo means joke.
It means joke, and basically it's something that is, capricious, playful, and we heard this Chopin
This is great
thing.
for a Jewish writer.
How so?
Humor.
Well,
famous Jewish humor.
Yeah, I mean, sure, I guess. Yeah. Jewish history. It's a big joke. Yeah, I mean, I think the main idea is that you, in a scherzo, at least as realized by Chopin, you have a lot of contrasting ideas, and the juxtapositions are whimsical, capricious, unexpected. And that's what gives it its sort of joke-like character. Although, in this particular piece, and in fact, 3 out of the 4 Chopin scherzos, that unexpectedness gives it also a quality of violence and menace. The main theme here, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. That's obviously extremely stormy and dramatic, etc., etc. So it's humor with an edge.
Very interesting. It basically took me the whole book to understand what this might be referring to. Zuckerman says, I didn't know what to make of it there, or rather, what Lonov made of it, until I remembered that Amy Billette could play Chopin with great charm. Maybe it was she who had typed it out for him, scrupulous attribution and all, enclosing it perhaps with the gift of a record so that in the late afternoons he could listen to Chopin even when she was no longer around. Perhaps it was this very line she'd been musing upon when I first saw her on the study floor, musing because the description seemed as pertinent to herself as to the music.
Well, interesting, a couple of things there. It sometimes strikes me that writers, when they allude to classical music, are a little bit, I don't want to say at sea, but there's a little bit of a disjunction there. Because, for example, if she could play Chopin with great charm, if she could play this piece, then she was a hell of a pianist. Mm-hmm. Also, when you listen to this piece, there is a lot of Chopin that's charming, but you don't really associate charm with this piece particularly. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are charming moments, but that's not the main adjective. Oh, yeah, and the other thing is, did Schumann actually say this about this piece? I don't know.
Right.
It's entirely possible that quote was made up from whole cloth.
Interesting. We should find out for the
benefits
of our podcast, for the sake of the fretful listeners.
Yes, our Fretful Porpentine listeners.
Our fretful listeners would probably like to know that. Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, it's relevant here, and we're going to just spoil the plot of this book, but Amy Billette turns out to be either is Anne Frank having survived, or she thinks and believes that she's Anne Frank having survived.
Wow.
Yes.
The last one will surprise you.
It sounds really hokey, and it's pretty amazing how Roth pulls this off. I think it does work, because Roth's great burden as an artist was how he served his Jewish heritage, basically, because he came under horrible fire and criticism after Portnoy's complaint for having made Jews look bad and for having betrayed the Jews. And obviously in the 1950s, people were very worked up about the Jewish question and fitting in, right? I mean, Nathan Zuckerman's father in this book is apoplectic at what Zuckerman is writing, and Zuckerman, and Zuckerman resents it. So I think both he and Lonoff later in the book end up competing for Amy Billet's affection and her endorsement, basically. If the greatest Jewish writer of all time, Anne Frank, is okay with you, then you're okay. I would imagine is what he's trying to say, although probably there are academics who would disagree with me. The point being, though, that I ended up thinking that this overflowing with tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt was a summary of how Zuckerman felt about the Jews.
Yeah, I think that's actually very good indeed. And of course, the introduction of an Anne Frank motif is a gigantic, fuck you to his critics, as you point out. I mean, because he's saying, look, not only am I Jewishing correctly, so to speak,
right,
but I'm Jewishing so well that I have the approval of Anne Frank. Therefore, the rest of you who, didn't like my Portnoy's Complaint, which is a very scabrous book, you can all fuck off, basically.
I haven't read Portnoy's Complaint, and I'm now on a Roth bender, and I'm about to read the biography, the Blake Bailey biography. In addition to Portnoy's Complaint, I really want to read The Breast, which is a surrealist book where he pretends to be a female breast, something like that.
Yeah, see, here's the thing. I haven't read The Breast, but I know a little bit about it. Take that how you will. I have read Portnoy. I read Portnoy's Complaint back in, I don't know, like the 70s or something like that, and it was very scandalous. And in order to understand both of those books, and this is almost impossible for us now, we have to understand the whole climate of that time, which was that Jews were, and sort of the cultural world of New York City and beyond, was just saturated with Freud, right? Like Freud and psychoanalysis was like, there's a song, Kafka was the rage. Well, Kafka was the rage, but Freud was really the rage. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea that, fear of sex, right? It's all about like anxiety and fear around sex. Like there's a joke somewhere in Woody Allen. He says, what's the difference between sex and death? Well, you don't get sick after death. Like, a joke like that is incomprehensible to us now.
I don't even understand that joke.
No, you don't understand it. Nobody understands that joke now.
You supposedly get sick after sex?
Because of the anxiety that is supposedly associated with sex in the sort of Freudian psychoanalytic worldview, at least as channeled through, whatever, the zeitgeist of New York City in the 60s or whatever.
We're not anxious anymore.
We're not anxious anymore.
Totally, we've gotten over that. Freud was wrong.
Well, either he was wrong or he was so right that he succeeded and de-anxietized us. That's a possibility. But I think a lot of it just has to do with sort of our culture, our American culture, being so kind of saturated with sex that everybody is just sort of like, yeah, whatever.
You mean now?
Now.
Right.
Yeah, we've transitioned into this.
Right.
So the idea that a breast could be associated with fear and anxiety, I think, I don't remember entirely, but I think the hero is pursued by a gigantic breast. Right? So that's the fear of being suffocated by the mother, possibly literally, being suffocated by the enormities, the twin enormities. And
keep it clean. And the Fretful Porpentine is a clean podcast.
Is this a family podcast, Valerie? We haven't addressed that matter. I don't think it is.
I know. No, I'm afraid it's not. But anyway. Wait, we've wandered way off the track of the Scherzo, but I thought that something interesting that you were saying earlier was when you were saying that this particular Scherzo has a great amount of violence and disturbingness in it, basically, that it's not a light joke, if it's a joke at all. And I mean, Roth may have been stretching plausibility when he said that Amy Billet, be she Anne Frank or not, could play Chopin that well, but he did pick a pretty good piece of music to convey these clashing and strongly and violently clashing feelings that Zuckerman, for example, might have had about his Jewish heritage, if that's what the quote is really intending to address. Tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt. It wasn't these feelings that the character has about his Jewish heritage, if those are what Roth intends, do have a certain amount of violence and menace in them. And we heard that in the Scherzo.
Right. So I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking in part is that do those attributes actually attach to this music?
Right. Well, I had not verbalized that, but that is my main question, is do these attributes attach to this music? What do you think, Jeffrey?
Let's have them again. 1, 2, 3, 4. What are they?
Tenderness, boldness, love, and contempt.
Okay, fine.
I'd say tenderness and boldness, yes. Love and contempt, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, love, if you have feelings for a woman and you're watching her play this piece with charm and elan and all that sort of thing, I think love, love of the beautiful.
No, but love is love in the piece?
Yeah,
Can a piece of music express love?
I would turn that around. Can a piece of music not express love? If
all music expresses love? No.
I think there's something in the artistic endeavor that where the love of beauty and the longing for beauty is intrinsic to the enterprise. That's like the Goethe thing.
Longing for beauty isn't the same thing as love, though. And love of beauty is only one kind of love. When I say love, I don't mean love of beauty.
Yeah, I don't know. We're sort of wading into like very murky sorts of, I am reminded of, I think at the end of Faust, I forget which part, where Goethe says something about das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinauf. The eternal feminine draws us upwards. Mm-hmm. And, you're not supposed to obviously, talk in terms like the eternal feminine nowadays. It's very, frowned upon. But I don't care. So, but just to kind of pull it back to earth, so to speak, so one of the questions that I think you have is contempt. Mm-hmm. That's the one that seems hardest to pull off. I'm going to show you contempt. I will show you contempt in a handful of dust.
Is this the same? Are you showing us part of,
in this piece?
In this piece where you think you hear contempt?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Let's hear it.
So contempt in music, I think we talked earlier about a song by Hugo Wolf called Spottlied, and Lied meaning song, and Spott, which is cognate with spite, means mockery in German.
The spiteful song.
Right, the mockery, exactly, the mockery song. And it goes something like, Ich armer Teufel, Herr Baron. So that's the spite and the contempt. And if you say, well, where is this contempt? It's in the chromaticism. Sort of digging at you, right? Da, 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 da. And in fact, it's a song about envy. So the question would be, in Chopin, do we have something that's equivalent to that or similar? And I think we do. So at the very end of the piece that we just heard, the Scherzo, Chopin is working up to his peroration. And I think you hear triumph, but you also hear mockery and contempt. We'll just play the last few seconds of the piece. It seems to me that that's quite strident.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
sort of...
No, I think you actually can hear it. I think that Roth has chosen his piece of music very well. That makes me think that Schumann probably did say this, and that Roth came across that somewhere and said, oh, that piece of music is the right piece for my purposes. Like maybe it came first, the Schumann quote came first in Roth's understanding of this piece of music.
Right. Which came first, the quote or the excerpt?
Exactly. No, I think it was a good choice.
Good. Well, so I think we've said a little bit about classical music as it finds itself, sort of ensconced in the context of this novel, but I think really serving kind of a symbolic purpose, which obviously is what Roth wanted it to do, wouldn't you say?
I think so. There was another quote on Lonov's wall, which was a quote from a Henry James story. I think the piece of music and then the Henry James quote, in a way, also sort of go together.
And let me guess, the Henry James quote is about 2,000 words long.
No, it's surprisingly short. So Henry James, this is from a story called The Middle Years, and James wrote, "We work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task. The rest is the madness of art."
Well...
that's...
Lord? Yeah, it's kind of unimprovable. It's simultaneously inspiring and kind of gaseous in that sort of...
Jamesian way?
In that Jamesian way.
Ooh, the Fretful Porpentine is anti-Henry James.
Well, I'm not saying that, but it's just such a Jamesian quote by Henry James.
Did we talk at all about how the scherzo is not particularly representative of most Chopin, or was that untrue?
I don't know. Chopin was such a shapeshifter. Actually, this piece, which, by the way, is the most famous of the four scherzos, and I think one reason that it is, if I were to say that this piece is almost Chopin caricaturing Chopin, that would be wrong. That would be an absolutely incorrect thing to say. And yet, there is something about this piece which is very much, you don't feel this, but you almost feel Chopin sat down to write a piece and said, I'm going to write something that's so Chopinesque that, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, and we did talk about this earlier because it's my sort of uneducated opinion on Chopin that, it's all very beautiful and romantic, and you think of the nocturnes and you think of it as gentle. You don't think of it as dramatic and passionate and conflicting like this. But I think you've said that that's a misapprehension just based on his most famous works.
Yeah, that's kind of... That's a myth, really. Chopin, as popularly understood and received, is sometimes thought to be a kind of creature of the moonlight, and he dips his pen in, moonlight, and writes these sort of gauzy and...
Right, like neurasthenic.
Yes, the neurasthenic tubercular poet.
Right, exactly. Not really the case.
That is a side of Chopin, and that comes actually from one of probably the most famous of the nocturnes, which is famous for a couple of different reasons. One is because a lot of people play it, because it's fairly easy to play. An intermediate pianist can sort of hack I could get through it. Mm-hmm. And that means
my dad can play it.
Yeah. But also because it's extremely beautiful. But it has kind of underwritten that notion of Chopin as this,
dreamy and romantic and beautiful instead of energetic and clashing and violent.
Correct. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about Chopin another time. I hope that we will. But this kind of wraps it up And it points out that Chopin was a very complex character, even if he was kind of a dick to his mentor Schumann, which we haven't spoken about, but he was. And it also tells us some things about Roth.
Oh, wait, what did he say about... He said there was some mean, snarky quote where Schumann was praising Chopin, and then Chopin said something shitty back. Do you remember?
Yeah. Schumann wrote a particularly effusive review, and Chopin said, Schumann sounds as though he had eaten a pot of honey.
Right. I mean, way to pay back your rave reviewers.
Right.
Beautiful adjoining for the next time. This is the Fretful Porpentine, Valerie Stivers.
Jeffrey Gross, and thank you for being with us.